This is not Victor. This is Linda Velia, and I am co-presenting with Victor. So thank
Good
you for
morning.
choosing. Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for choosing to spend part of your morning with us. We're here to share with you the results of our study on using the TEDS or treatment episode dataset for predicting the risk for homelessness. I am co-presenting with my student, Victor Moxley, who is the principal investigator of the study, and he will be introducing himself.
Thank you, Len. I just want to say Len's been a great mentor for this research. I'm a third-year law student at BYU Law School, specializing in access to healthcare and housing policy. As an undergraduate student studying statistics, I noticed a huge demand for adequate housing in my area and started a property management company. And this only increased my interest in access to housing and some of the injustices that go on in the housing market. I wanted to see the intersection of those fields, so I started doing more research to find how housing and access to healthcare intersected with vulnerable populations such as those with substance use disorders. And I'll go ahead and let Len introduce herself.
Thank you, Victor. I am Linda Velia, and I am an associate professor at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. I am grateful for the opportunity to serve in various capacities at the department and university levels and for the state of Utah. My research interests are on the social determinants of health, health equity, integrating public health and healthcare, and on the family as a setting of health promotion and sustaining link between public health and healthcare. Next, please. We would like to start our presentation with the background and significance of our study. This particular section will delve on the what, when, where, how, and why of the local and federal TEDS within the context of the clinical treatment setting. We will focus on the definition of key terms, such as housing assistance, TEDS, and paired local data. Victor will start us off with the definition of terms.
One of the terms we'll be discussing quite a bit is the treatment episode dataset. This is a publicly available dataset from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And it's really two separate datasets, a dataset of admissions and a dataset of discharges. When we talk about the paired local data that we actually used for this study, this has the data that was collected for admissions and discharges combined into a single dataset. So that we could analyze those together, which is a limitation of the treatment episode data set with SAMHSA that we'll discuss more. And after we go through this further discussion, then Len will present our research question. But backing up into some of why we did this research, I started this research as a master's student, but it's continued into my time at law school. This painting, Maynard Dixon's Forgotten Man, hangs in the lobby of BYU's law school. It's one of our dean's favorite paintings. He likes to emphasize this painting to us as the importance of making sure that in the legal field, we're protecting the most vulnerable, those that are often forgotten by society or the justice system. Those who are homeless or struggle with substance use disorders are some of the most vulnerable and most frequently forgotten.
Maynard Dixon's Forgotten Man is a homeless man. It depicts the fall from grace of many individuals in society who are facing difficult times and have fallen through the cracks in our system. Having a home is not simply a surrogate measure of one's place in society. Aside from being used as a demographic measure of social economic status, owning a home is deeply attached to one's experiences in life, particularly of one's identity and worth. Thus, the loss of a home can mean the loss of the grounding influence of employment. Worst, it can signify the loss of hope from the physical, mental, social, and spiritual challenges associated with addiction. Next slide, please. Overcoming an addiction is challenging in and of itself, particularly for those who are homeless. In treating substance abuse, it is important to concurrently assess the need for housing assistance the moment an individual seeks treatment. Now focus on the flow chart at the bottom of the slide. During the intake process, the client is required to complete several assessment forms that are not only duplicative, but are also costly and time-intensive. For instance, a potential client typically completes the local TEDS upon admission. just like what you could see here on the second box. However, the client is also required to complete another two-stage pre-screening tool for housing assistance, the VI-SPDAT and the full SPDAT. Both are independently tested and internally reviewed intake forms for single individuals and families for assessing housing needs. VI-SPDAT is Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. It is a pre-screening tool used by frontline workers in agencies that serve homeless clients to quickly assess whether an individual has high, moderate, or low acuteness of housing needs. It helps determine which among their clients needing treatment should first be given the full SPDAT assessment, which happens next. So, SPDAT is the Family or Single Individual Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. This is the full assessment of needs for housing assistance. Once completed, it adds the individual on the list for housing assistance, such as transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, or other permanent housing programs. Next slide, please.
It's the duplication of some of that information and then the many forms that patients have to fill out, many of them asking about some of the same things, that informed the study and made us wonder if the federal treatment episode data set can be used to inform housing care for individuals in substance use disorder treatment, help fill in information later on in the SPDAT, or even be used as a screening tool of its own to identify whether patients need housing assistance while in substance use disorder treatment. To help you be a little more familiar with the treatment episode data set, a patient comes into treatment, and as they're admitted into treatment, federally mandated questionnaires are administered to the patient to get admissions information. This information is submitted from the local providers to substance abuse treatment authorities, on to state authorities, and then to the federal government with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that makes it available in the TEDS-A data set, a publicly available data set. The client continues through treatment, and then as they complete a level of care or are discharged completely from treatment, more of their information is taken to determine discharge outcomes. These are submitted through the same system as the admissions records, and finally on to the TEDS discharge data set with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. When we talk about the TEDS data set, it's really two discrete data sets. There's the list of admissions and the list of discharges. In order to protect patient privacy, these aren't linked. There's no way to tell at the federal level which admissions went with which discharges, or even which went with which patient. Many of the studies that study the TEDS data look exclusively at the admissions record or exclusively at the discharge record, without any way to link admissions information to outcome at discharge. The state of Utah and a few other states do this differently. When an admissions record is sent at the beginning of a treatment episode, the providers include patient identifying information so that the patient can be followed through treatment at the state level. When a patient is discharged from a level of care to discontinue treatment or to transfer to a different level of care, such as going from a detox stay in this case to a residential stay, the discharge record submitted to the state by the local providers includes the patient identifiers as well as identifiers for which admission that it was paired with. So a patient can be tracked through treatment, and they can also track outcomes from the patient's condition as they were admitted to treatment to their condition as they leave treatment.
So how does the TEDS form look like? The local TEDS documents the demographic and drug history information of individuals admitted for treatment. The TEDS has two main components, as Victor mentioned. On the left side of your screen will be for TEDS-A for the admission information, and on the right hand of your screen is a TEDS-D for the discharge information. The two data sets are separate.
We only have the, sorry, Len, unfortunately, we only have the TEDS discharge on the screen right now.
So because an individual can be admitted and discharged from treatment multiple times, each record on TEDS is an admission information and not an individual record. So the local TEDS information is submitted to the federal level TEDS database as a de-identified admission information. The federal TEDS contains information on almost 2 million admissions every year. as reported by over 10,000 facilities to the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Enormous logistics is necessary for standardizing the information collected during admission and discharge at the local level. And this is why there's a 12-month delay in making the data available to the public. In addition, states vary in their reporting load. Thank you, Victor. Next slide, please.
So due to the limitations that we had in the TEDS data set itself, that's usually studied for the TEDS data, we couldn't follow patients through level of care. So instead, this study looks at the data directly from one of the local substance abuse treatment authorities, directly at the provider data in the electronic medical record system. The advantage of this is that we had the admissions information collected for submission to TEDS in the same medical record stored in the same table as the discharge information. This allowed our analysis to trace patients through their levels of care, especially to look at their condition at admission to their outcomes at discharge.
We have discussed the what, when, where, and why of the local TEDS data. However, we still don't know the how of its uses. For instance, how are the TEDS information used? Who uses the information? For those on the front end of the data collection, the TEDS seems to be this big elephant of a data set in the room, which no one can fully describe or optimally use, just like the blind man and the elephant. So what do we hope to share with you in terms of the uses of the local TEDS data? Let's turn to the next slide for our research questions. In this study, we hope to answer the following research questions. First, which patients are at risk for homelessness and need housing intervention? Second, is it possible to study paired admissions and discharge data as a combined data set? And next, can federal reporting data be used as a clinical tool? That is, can the local TEDS admission be used to predict a patient's risk for homelessness? Victor will give us a summary of the methods and analysis. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to walk you through how we collected the data from the local medical record system, the sample of patient data that we had available for our study, which was a convenient sample, and how we coded the study variables using variables typically only available in the treatment episode data set with SAMHSA, and how we conducted the statistical analysis on those to compare patients' baseline at admission to their condition at discharge, namely looking at whether they were homeless at discharge. All of the data was collected from the local electronic medical record system at Utah County Drug and Alcohol in Provo, Utah. We used data available directly from the electronic medical record system instead of the federal repository that's normally studied with TEDS data. Again, this was because of the limitation with the admissions and discharge being separate, disconnected data sets at the federal level. And all of the data that we had was gathered from interviews with the clients at admission or discharge from treatment by licensed mental health therapists. Each of the patients in our sample was diagnosed with at least one substance use disorder. And while we looked at individual patient records, our study unit was the admission with its subsequent discharge. So if a patient had been admitted multiple times, we treated each of those admissions separately. Due to the limited number of patients that had been admitted multiple times, we weren't able to look at client level effects. We looked at each individual stay as its own separate unit without regard for which patient went with which episode. However, we did look at which admissions went with which discharges. And in our sample, 185 of the clients were homeless at least admission or discharge. All of them had completed at least one treatment episode during the study period from July 1st, 2015 to October 18th, 2017. In order to protect the most vulnerable in our study and their privacy, we excluded minors or those under 18 years old and any of the patients currently incarcerated at any point in their stay in jail or prison. We used variables typically available in studies using the treatment episode data set. However, as I said, pulled directly from the medical record rather than the federal repository. We followed methods very similar to those using just the admissions or discharge record, namely methods close to Menace installers. However, we recoded housing since that was our outcome variable in the discharge so that any of the patients who had some level of housing were treated as housed versus any of the patients who were on the street or in a homeless shelter were treated as homeless for the outcome. All of our outcomes with housing was pulled from the discharge record, and our predictive variables, the independent variables, were pulled from the admissions record. We looked at all variables available in the typical TEDS data set at the federal level. We looked at demographics, their substances used, justice involvement, like whether they had been convicted or the number of arrests prior to admission, their diagnoses, not just diagnoses with substance abuse or mental health disorders, but we had medical diagnoses as well in the data set. We looked at socioeconomic status, like whether they were currently employed and their monthly income, their education and years of education completed, and family status, such as whether they were married or number of children in their household. We started off by importing the data directly from the medical record system into SAS 9.4 and started with a univariate analysis looking at which of the variables were associated with housing at discharge. Then we did a logistic regression with risk of homelessness as the output, using automatic model selection to determine, when adjusting for other variables, which variables were associated with homelessness. We kept the global P level below 0.05, as well as a variable P level below 0.05 in choosing which variables would remain in the model. We noticed as we were doing this analysis in the logistic regression, though, that one of the variables, age, was statistically significant for the overall variable, but not for any of the categories. I did a Bonferroni post hoc analysis to determine that there wasn't a statistically significant difference between our youngest patients, those between 18 and 30, and the middle age group between 30 and 45. When we combined those two groups, there was a statistically significant difference with the patients over 45 years old. So we were able to retain that variable in our model.
Treatment programs typically focus only on abstinence instead of addressing substance use disorder as a systemic illness with complex physical, mental, and social components that require multiple support, hence the need for a comprehensive harm reduction strategy. Now, let's look at the pie graph. Interestingly, our results showed that those who ended up being homeless upon discharge were not homeless on admission. This means that those who were not homeless when admitted to a treatment facility actually lost their homes by the time of discharge. During the treatment process, it was possible that there was an inordinate focus on abstinence, that the social and employment needs necessary for keeping one's home were unmet or overlooked, instead of being given equal attention. Victor will describe for us the profile of an individual who is at risk for being homeless. Next slide, please.
Well, thanks, Len. Yeah, as Len was discussing, many of those who were homeless at the end of treatment weren't homeless when they started treatment episode, suggesting while they were focusing greatly on patients who were homeless when they started treatment, there were patients who were stably housed when they started an episode that lost the housing in the meantime without adequate intervention. Our model, not surprisingly, included whether they were homeless at admission as a key predictor of whether they would be homeless at discharge, but there were a few other variables that were predictive too, such as whether they were over 45 years old, used methamphetamines, or had co-occurring mental health disorders besides their substance use disorder. In consulting with our clinical team, many of them suggested that this was the profile of some of the patients that had been through repeat episodes of care. Patients that had switched to harder drugs like methamphetamines and whose mental health disorders kept them from either being successful in treatment or caused them to continue to self-medicate. As we use just a convenient sample, we could look at more study outcomes by looking at state level data or even federal data if it were ever possible to pair at the federal level. This would allow us to look at more of the patient level effects following patients through treatment and seeing the effects of things like multiple treatment episodes. Eventually, we'd like to be able to package this data for clinical use, and if it's valid, be able to show indicators to providers that if they're at risk for homelessness based on the federally required data, the TEDS data, that we can get earlier housing intervention if they're not already homeless, or screening under tools like the VI-SPDAT. Using paired data also has the advantage that we could look at other treatment outcomes previously studied by looking at just the discharge data and see if these can have more complete models by including variables from the admission. So other studies could look at treatment completion with admissions information, arrests and incarceration, or changes in use frequency. As we validate this use of the TEDS data through cohort studies and checks of internal and external consistency, we might be able to make a case to overcome privacy concerns and adopt paired data at the state level or even in the federal level with SAMHSA. And I'll let Len go ahead and share our practice implications.
So, what can we take away from these findings? First, substance abuse is a cause and a result of homelessness, particularly if it's co-occurring with mental illness. Second, the first 3 bullet points focus on the importance of identifying individuals with substance use disorders who are at risk for homelessness. This risk for homelessness, if unmet, can jeopardize the treatment success. The loss of a home can mean the loss of motivation to abstain from substances. It also means the loss of one's support network, as many are estranged from families and friends who could have provided support to overcome addiction. It becomes particularly tough to remain sober when one remains on the streets versus having the stabilizing influence of a home, since individuals will likely cycle from being on the streets, jail, and emergency rooms, which increases the risk for violence and victimization. Third, which encompasses the next 2 bullet points, affirm how rich of a data set the TEDS is. The TEDS is a rich source of clinical data if made available to providers. Local and federal mandated questionnaires could be used in novel ways. The TEDS can be used in clinical and public health settings to predict homelessness among those dealing with substance use disorders. For a copy of our full study, please go to moxley.tech/TEDS_homelessness. Next slide. Thank you so much, and it has been a pleasure to share our study with you. And if we still have time for 1 or 2 questions, we would be happy to answer them for you.